see the light.
Okay.
Great. All right, so we're going to start with chapter 13 with a verse 1, which is a little bit confusing. Let me tell you what happened in the original Hebrew of this verse. The year total is missing in the original manuscripts. It says Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel. Those years are added in there in the documents, but they're not in the original. And so it's a very difficult verse to completely understand. Most people, you recognize right away that Saul did not reign 1 year. We all know Saul reigned more than 1 year. And when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, they're talking about this being, you could read that as perhaps this happened in his second year. This is what he did. But we know that there's a greater amount of time that has passed from where we left chapter 12 until we get to chapter 13. Saul has adult sons who are in their 30s at this time. Saul has been... we don't know exactly how many years Saul has been king of Israel, but we know that there's been a significant period of time. So the time frame that's put on there, for the most parts, it says, my translation says the Hebrew is difficult to understand. Most people supply the word 40 as the best available estimate. It gets really confusing, and as I read each commentary, it gets more and more confusing. Let's just say that verse 1 is not a very well transcribed verse. And we know that there is the important part for our study is that there is a significant number of years that have passed between the time we leave Saul in chapter 12 and now we're on chapter 13. So let's look at verse 2. Saul chose for himself 3,000 men out of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the mountains of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the rest of the people he sent away, every man to his tent. So, 3,000 men being brought in, 2,000 stay with Saul. That's an important number because that's going to winnow down here as we get through this chapter. But 2,000 start with Saul, and then 1,000 start with a new character that we haven't really discussed, which is Jonathan. Jonathan is Saul's son, adult, grown son. He is, we're going to read quite a bit about Jonathan as we move forward in the chapter. He becomes a very critically important part of the story interwoven with David. And so we'll get to know a lot about Jonathan. So 1,000 people stay with Jonathan, showing that Jonathan has a significant military part of all of this. The rest of the people they send away. So, verse 3. And Jonathan attacked the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it. A garrison is just a troop group, an army, a significant number of people. It doesn't necessarily mean any particular number, but it's a group or a troop of people. So they're in Gibeah and Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it. So when they hear of it, they're not happy. Saul then has a call to war. He blows the trumpet. Now that's the shofar. That call to. I've heard him do it in the synagogue, where they do the call to war. They just demonstrate it just for interesting. Sorry about this, YouTube. It goes. It's that fast beating thing that gets everyone's attention. That call to war. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all of the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." Now all Israel heard it said that Saul had attacked a garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel had become an abomination to the Philistines. What does that mean? It just means that they were mad. The Philistines are mad. So when it says Israel became an abomination, they're coming after them. They're very upset and they're very angry. And the people were called together to Saul at Gilgal. So they're kind of structuring how they're going to handle all of this. Then the Philistines gathered together to fight with Israel. 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen. This is the Philistine army that they're describing here. So look how big they are. 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and the people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and encamped in Michmash to the east of Beth-aven. So Saul had been there earlier, you can tell by the previous verse, and he leaves. So there's a lot of maneuvering. Just keep in mind there's a lot of structural maneuvering. Saul has gone in, he's attacked, the Philistines are heard about it, they're mad, they gather together this massive army of people who go. Saul is sort of retreating, regathering this group of men. He's got 2,000, Jonathan's got 1,000. They're coming up against these numbers of Philistines. You know, it doesn't look super good. Verse 6, and when the men of Israel saw that they were in danger, for the people were distressed, yeah, you think, then the people hid in the caves and in the thickets and in rocks and in holes and in pits. So they recognize that this huge army of Philistines is coming. They recognize that they have a small number, so they do what people tend to do when you're afraid. You go and hide. You find a hole to hide in, whether it's a pit, whether it's a cave, whether it's in the bushes, whatever it is, this is where the people were going. So they're hiding. Verse 7, and some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. So they're escaping. We're going to read about them in a future time, but they're escaping and going away. They actually will, some of them will link up with the Philistines at a later time. So let's just see what happens with them. As for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Why would they be trembling?
Right.
They're afraid, right? They know this is a bad deal for them. Then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So a lot of people will take this verse and go back to chapter 10. Remember in chapter 10 when Samuel said, go and wait 7 days for me and then I'll come in chapter 10? And I said, some commentaries call it the first failure of Saul. And they'll tie it in with that and say that's the 7 days. Actually, quite a few of the commentaries that I read said that's the 7 days. But remember the time frame chronologically on this. This is a long time down the road. Saul's been king for quite some time. It doesn't make any sense that way back before he was ever anointed, Samuel said, now you're going to wait for me for 7 days, and then years later, however many years that is, that's the instruction that Saul is supposed to remember. It's more likely that 7 days is a common time of waiting. You know, when people would say something along the lines of, well, next week I'll be there. We'll do it next week. So there's a 7-day time frame that seems to be a common waiting period of time. I can't see in any way, regardless of what you see in the commentaries, I can't see how this ties in with chapter 7 in any way. But at some point, Samuel has told Saul again, you're going to need to wait for me for 7 days, and we're going to see what Saul does with that. So, verse 8, then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, bring a burnt offering and a peace offering here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. Okay, this is important. Don't mistake, because there is going to be a huge price to pay for this. So recognize the importance of what Saul has done. This is the 7 days. So we're on the 7th day. That's important because something's going to happen here in just a minute. And Saul says, I need you to bring the offerings that would normally precede a military event, and I'm going to offer them. Why would that be a horrible thing?
So he's not a priest.
Mm-hmm. What tribe is he from?
Benjamin.
Is that the priestly tribe?
No, he's not a Levite.
And he's not a Levite. And so does he have any right to make offering?
No.
In fact, God is very clear that that is never to occur.
You can't be a king and a priest except
And you cannot be a king and a priest. God, that's a really good point, because remember, God makes it very clear back in Genesis, in the beginning, that the kingly division is going to come from the tribe of Judah. Okay, so Saul, being a Benjamite, we talked about it, is very unusual that he would come from the tribe of Benjamin and be a king. But the priests were to come from the Levites. Okay, they were not to have any kings come from the Levites, but the priests were. Very, very clear that God does not want that civil responsibility and that religious responsibility to intertwine. Okay, very clear. Now, does he want his kings to have a religious, a religious spirit about them and to have all of that? Of course he does. He wants them to follow him with all their heart and all of that. But there was not to be this priestly and kingly interaction that goes on at all at this point. So God had set it up that way. So what Saul does here is very, very wrong in the eyes of God. It is not at all what he wanted. Verse 10. Now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering. Keep in mind, this is on the 7th day. He's just presented the offering. And who comes up but Samuel? That Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. So it is still the 7th day. So Samuel does show up at the appropriate time, but it's at the end of the 7th day. So Saul just needed to wait because it says he just finished offering. You can imagine that the smell of the burnt offering is probably still in the air, still going on. The coals are still hot. Everything is just happening. And so Samuel shows up just as Saul finishes that. Verse 11, and Samuel says, "What have you done?" What have you done, Saul? Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattered from me," so they're running and hiding and they're leaving, "and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash," which is very close to where he is. So what does Saul begin to do?
Make excuses.
Make excuses and point the fingers. It's the people, and you're late getting here, and I see the Philistines. We can't hang around and just wait forever. And so excuse. Does any of that make any difference to what God has decided? No. Then I said, in verse 12, "The Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering." So he's basically saying, I just didn't have a choice. I just had to do this my way in order to make it the right way. So let's see what happens when Samuel hears all those wonderful excuses from Saul. Verse 13, and Samuel says to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever." So now that's really important, a little important a piece of information there. He's saying you didn't do what God wanted you to do, and even though you're not from Judah, and even though we learn later, were not the first choice of the Lord, he would have created in you a dynasty to be able to hand over to your sons at some future time. So he's not coming against Saul yet. The punishment isn't against Saul yet, but he's saying the future, this would have gone down through your sons. But look at verse 14. He says, "But now your kingdom shall not continue." So it's not going to hand over to your sons. "The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So is he kicking Saul out? No, he's not. He's not kicking Saul out at this point. He's not taking anything away from Saul at this point, but he is telling him, your kingdom is not going to continue. It's not going to go past you. There's no dynasty involved. And now the Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. We know who that was. It's going to be who?
David.
David. That's the man after God's own heart. Does Samuel know that yet? Not that we're aware of, unless God's whispered something in his ears and it's not written down for us to hear. But at this point, what Samuel does know is that God has chosen a man after his own heart, that Saul has already messed up, that it's not going to be handed down. And so it's obvious, if it's not going to be handed down, that when the kingdom is taken from Saul, it's going to go to this man who is the man selected by God after his own heart. That's really important for us to gather that in, because there's going to be huge conflict between this man after God's own heart and Saul. And we need to remember why. Because he already knows from this verse, one, it's going to go directly from you to this man that God chooses. And two, your sons are going to have nothing. There's no kingdom that's going to be passed on to you. So that's got to be devastating for Saul to hear that news. Verse 15, then Samuel arose and went from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people present with him, about 600 men. Okay, earlier on, how many had he started out with?
2,000.
Well, you're right, 3,000. 2,000 went with Saul, though, and 1,000 went with Jonathan. And so now how many are with Saul?
600.
Okay, so that means 1,400, even just with Saul, have fled and hid and gone back to their houses and are not hanging with him. That's one of the reasons why Saul was so eager to get started on all of this, because he saw his people going out and dispersing.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is Gibeah of Benjamin the same place as Jabesh?
No.
That was Gilead.
Oh,
No.
Gilead.
They
Okay.
sound, there's Geba, Gilgal, Gibeah, and
Okay.
there's a whole lot of names that sound a lot. In your packet from last week, there's a map, and it shows all of those places on the map. So when you get confused and you need to reference them, go back and look at the map, and you can see they're all in pretty close proximity, and they all sound the same. So it's a little bit tricky. All right, verse 16. Saul, Jonathan, his son, and the people present with them, so that's that 600 people, remained in Gibeah of Benjamin. But the Philistines encamped at Michmash. The raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in three companies. One company turned onto the road of Orphra to the land of Shaul, I guess is how you say that. Another company turned onto the road to Beth Horon, and another company turned to the road of the border that overlooks the valley of Zebium towards the wilderness. So it's just saying that the Philistines came down. I guess that three-prong attack is quite popular, because that's how they do it here also. The Philistines come down and they divide up to go and attack. Verse 17, an interesting little fact that I heard one time, I guess this is true. This is where Oprah Winfrey got her name. Her parents read that and they misspelled it.
Yeah.
I heard that too.
So I guess it's true. It is a rumor that's been out there for a long time. I know enough to know that rumors are not always true.
It could also be from Orpah.
Yeah, it could. It could, definitely. So verse 19. There was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make swords or spears. So in our very first introduction, we talked a little bit about one of the things that made the Philistines such a formidable foe is the fact that they could forge iron. And so because they could work with iron, their weapons were far above anything that anyone else had. They could have the big heavy shields. They could have all of the things that you would, swords and all of the things that you would need, because they knew how to forge iron. The Israelites at this point did not know how to do that. And so it appears that the Philistines really didn't want any blacksmiths or any of their people to go into the land of Israel and do this work, because it kept them at a distinct disadvantage. 20. But all the Israelites would go down to the Philistines to sharpen each man's plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his sickle. And so you don't see anything about weaponry there, but their farm tools would need some sharpening, and so they would go down and do that. And the charge for sharpening was a pem for the plowshares, the mattocks, the forks, and the axes, and to set the points on the goads. That's supposed to be about 2/3 of a shekel. I don't really know exactly how much that would be worth at that time, but there was a charge for them going down and taking care of their farm equipment. So it came about on the day of the battle that there was neither a sword nor a spear found in the hand of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and Jonathan, his son. So because of all of what I've just described to you, there was no weaponry. The Israelites would have bows and arrows and anything that they could make themselves out of wood or any type of equipment that way, but they didn't have anything, although it appears that Saul and Jonathan, the royal family, did have some weaponry that they had been able to get from the Philistines. So they had it, but the rest of the troops didn't. So you can see the complete disadvantage. Number-wise, chariot-wise, weapon-wise, in every way, the Philistines had every advantage over Israel. That's important because as we go through these stories, you're going to see how there are times when Israel is able to overcome that, and you have to recognize it's only because of God. It's only because of God that they're able to do this because the disadvantage was so distinct. Did you have something?
What I remember from Judges was that the Philistines wouldn't allow Israel to forge metal, but the Kenites were allowed to, and that's why they had the alliance with the Kenites.
So that they could get some of the weaponry from them?
Yeah, that's from the story of Sisera.
Okay.
Because you had the Kenite, that they were camped with the Kenites. I think Jael was a Kenite.
Okay.
And that's why they were.
So maybe that's how they got the weaponry. How
the only
Saul
way they could.
and Jonathan would have gotten the weaponry.
Yeah.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. All right. So and then verse 23, and the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass at Michmash. So that is going to set into that last verse there is going to set into movement it's going to set the stage for what Jonathan is going to do next. Is they moved and the Philistines are geared up and ready to attack there at Michmash.
Kathy, I don't understand that. It says there was not a sword or spear found in any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and Jonathan himself.
Yes.
Okay.
They had weaponry, although none of the people had any weaponry.
Okay.
Just the
They probably
king.
just had all their farm implements for their weapons.
Exactly. Exactly.
I wondered if that meant that's a good, they was looking at his heart. Saul and Jonathan had it and knew they needed it, but they didn't share it with any of the rest of them.
No, I think they realized that there was just no weaponry available to them. It just wasn't theirs. And the fact that Saul and Jonathan had it would be because he's king and he's the king's son. And there's always that discrepancy in how they're protected and how they're, all of that. But it certainly,
Well,
but
little
keep in mind,
they had it.
keep in mind what we just talked about, because now in chapter 14, Jonathan's deciding that he's going to do something about that. He wants to make a change in that. So when we get to 14, that background is going to be important for us.